So Starfield's coming out in like 4 weeks, 5 weeks, September sometime. And I'm trying to be hyped for it, I really am, but I don't think Bethesda knows how to write a video game anymore. You know? Like, the world looks fun, the gameplay looks engaging enough, but at the same time, I know that it's going to be filled with a bunch of nonsense non sequiturs and base, stupid contrivances, and it's just very hard to be excited for a game that I think is going to be badly written, you know? I'm getting ahead of myself, and that had nothing to do with anything. Alright, let's try that again. All writers want their audiences to care. It's the number one goal when crafting a story, to get the people following it to give a heck about what's going on, who is involved. There are numerous ways to generate audience empathy, and they run the gamut, from smart and clever to cheap and infuriating. We all know these kinds of storytelling basics, but it's worth exploring similar ideas across different stories to see how they handle the basic question of why should I care? And in no medium is that more pertinent than in video games. Video games are a unique medium in that the audience is also a necessary participant in the work itself. Unlike, say, interactive theater or similar art pieces which allow for audience participants to contribute to the work, a video game literally cannot function without someone hitting the buttons to make things go. Unlike a film or a television show where the audience is more or less captive to the linear flow of the narrative, video games allow us a degree of control over that story, to greater or lesser extent, dependent on the design of the game itself. In this way, playing a video game is less like watching a film or a show, and more like playing the lead role in such a production. We're placed in the role of a character, and asked to act as that character would in such a situation. When you play The Last of Us, you're asked to act in the role of Joel or Ellie, depending on the sequence and the game, of course. And when you play God of War, you're asked to act in the role of Kratos, and in Resident Evil Village, you're asked to act in the role of Ethan Winters. Of course, some games allow you the greater freedom to decide who you'll be playing as. This is much more common in Western role-playing games, or RPGs for short. RPGs developed by Bethesda, like the Elder Scrolls series, the upcoming Starfield, or the more recent entries in the Fallout series, allow you to craft your character's physical appearance, allowing you to make yourself, your friends, celebrities, or unholy abominations before God, unworthy of love and scorned by the light of heaven. The idea is that rather than playing a predefined character, you're playing one of your own creation, a version of you that you define. This works very well until it doesn't. And we can look at Bethesda's 2015 release Fallout 4 for an example and examination of just where this kind of design fails. The Fallout series is a self-described post-nuclear role-playing game, taking place some number of decades, either 20 years or 200 years, depending on which particular game you're talking about, after a nuclear war has devastated the world. In something of an inversion of our own reality, Fallout takes place in a world where nuclear technology evolved rapidly, while computer technology evolved slowly, and popular culture was more or less frozen in a state of 1950s atomic-age science fiction, with all the sleek curves, bright colors, and Robbie the Robot that entails, but often with a dark twist that belies the optimistic futurism to which that aesthetic is often attached. For example, one of the most iconic elements of the series is the vaults, large underground bunkers ostensibly designed for the preservation of a select population through the possible/inevitable nuclear war, sold as a kind of futuristic Noah's Ark to ride out the apocalypse, but which were really meant to gather test subjects for long-term isolated sci-fi experiments involving drugs or genetic modification or rampaging killbots. They're pretty fun. Fallout 4 begins with your character and their spouse living outside of Boston when the bombs drop. You escape with your infant son Sean to Vault 111, a vault designed to cryogenically freeze those inside as a method of testing the cryogenic freezing process. Sometime between when the bombs dropped and when the bulk of the game takes place, about 200 years later, the vault is infiltrated. You are unfrozen for a minute while your spouse is killed, and Sean is kidnapped for reasons unknown. And then you wake up again to go on a search for him through the region now known simply as the Commonwealth. Now, this is actually a pretty solid setup on its face, and in another game, this would be a very solid story engine. A parent searching for their lost child is a relatable dramatic conceit that many people can relate to. And even those without the experience of being a parent can understand and come to identify with that experience. However, the execution has a lot to be desired. And part of the issue lies simply in what kind of game Fallout 4 is, which is a large, open-world RPG where you are encouraged at points to do literally anything that is not the main plot. While the game will often nudge you in the direction of the main story, it does so almost as an afterthought. Because while it wants you to care about Sean, and wants you to identify as this parent searching for a lost child, it also doesn't want to railroad you or force you to do anything that you don't necessarily want to, instead allowing you, after a rather brief introduction sequence, to roam freely around the nuclear-devastated Boston at your leisure, blowing up super mutants or building ramshackle trash houses for people to live in because apparently no one thought to do that in the past 200 years. This is where we have to discuss something called ludonarrative dissonance, a term coined by game designer Clint Hawking, originally as part of a critique of the 2007 game BioShock. The term refers to when the story told by a game's narrative is in conflict with the story told through its gameplay. So, for our example, Fallout 4's narrative is about a parent desperately searching for their stolen child in nuclear-devastated Massachusetts. But Fallout 4's gameplay is about running around an open map for days on end, killing everything in sight and exploring every random nook and cranny you can find so you can establish settlements and build better laser guns to kill more powerful stuff and repeat the process. You are not only allowed to abandon the supposedly incredibly important search for your child, but you're actively encouraged to do so, with any number of random side stories and quest chains to keep you from the main narrative goal of finding Sean. And eventually, you do find Sean. It turns out he was taken decades before the main game takes place, and was raised to become the leader of a secret organization called the Institute, which has been killing people and replacing them with replicants for some reason. No one can explain why they're doing this. They're just doing it to do it. By the time you find him, he's an old man, and he's been doing some pretty terrible stuff. This is supposed to be a sort of tragic moment, but it falls apart because, well, it's not like Sean was ever really a character before this point. Honestly, he could have been dead the whole time and it wouldn't have mattered, since we only knew him as a baby. And as the title of the essay states, I don't care about the baby. The problem is that Fallout 4 wants to have its cake and eat it too. The game wants us to have a personal connection with Sean, but it also doesn't want us to care to the point of ignoring all the rest of the fun activities in the sandbox. So it does none of the work to actually make us care. We as an audience know Sean as a baby for all of maybe 5 minutes. We see him in the crib, we talk about him with our spouse, and then the bombs drop and he's taken away shortly after. He's not a character, he has no lines, and no moments where the player can come to care beyond the idea that he's ostensibly our child, and so we should care because herp derp we're his parent. But the game denies us even the fleeting feeling of being a parent by having your spouse be the one to carry Sean to the vault, and having him be ripped from their arms, which, had they reversed it, would have gone at least some of the way to making the player feel a bit more protective of him. As it stands, he's more or less just a MacGuffin, a plot device around which the story revolves, but which serves very little real purpose beyond that. This MacGuffin-esque nature means that the later revelation that he's the head of the villainous institute also fails. After all, you can't really be betrayed by someone who basically never existed in the first place. This all stands in stark contrast to another game about a parent searching for their missing child, the 2021 release Resident Evil Village, the 8th main installment in the long-running series. In that game, you play as Ethan Winters, who has settled in Europe with his wife Mia and newborn daughter Rose following the events of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. The game opens with the player as Ethan, watching as Mia reads their daughter a scary bedtime story, and your first task as Ethan is to carefully carry Rose up to her crib to put her to bed for the night. Shortly after, series protagonist Chris Redfield bursts in with his personal anti-crazy monster squad, totally murders Mia, and kidnaps Rose and Ethan. And the game proper begins when the truck Ethan was being taken in crashes outside a remote Eastern European village ruled by a cult, led by prophetess Mother Miranda and her 4 lords. The ferrokinetic Carl Heisenberg, the mute doll maker Donna Beneviento, the mutant fishman Salvatore Moreau, and the internet's favorite giant vampire lady, Alcina Dimitrescu. It's revealed that Mother Miranda has taken Rose and wishes to use her as a vessel to revive her own daughter, and Ethan must combat the 4 lords and Miranda in order to get her back. Right away, we are encouraged to identify with Ethan and with this child, with our first task being to actually care for this child. As you bring Rose to bed, there are numerous photos and toys and baby monitors around the house that the player can prompt Ethan to comment on, further entrenching Rose's importance in Ethan's life, and illustrating to the player how deep that affection goes, allowing for a greater identification with Ethan as a parent. When series protagonist Chris Redfield shows up to put some bullets in Mia and kidnap Rose, this betrayal further pushes us to identify with Ethan, who's feeling the same shock that longtime players who've known Chris since the first games in the series would be feeling. It also doesn't hurt that Village features a more or less linear game and narrative design. While you're allowed to explore the titular village, you're restricted from certain areas until you progress the story enough to have certain keys or tools. Meaning that at any one time there's really only the one thing to do, which is to search for Rose and fight the lords. By the time you reach the final confrontation with Mother Miranda, the player will have been so focused on the one task that their motives and Ethan's should ideally perfectly align into one: wanting to save Rose. The contrast is rather clear. Where Fallout 4 does little to nothing to establish your character's parenthood and thus leaves the main storyline to fester until you happen to feel like doing it, Village makes its protagonist's parenthood a central narrative feature, and front-loads a lot of the work in hopes that you'll identify with Ethan's desperate search as a means of powering through the horrific monsters and environments you find, with the sheer fun of the idea of exploring the next haunted house being a backstop motivator, should you still decide you don't really care about the baby. This illustrates that personal motivations for player characters demand more than simple, ostensible motives, and that you should still do the actual work to make players care, even when they should. Of course, the smartest, though perhaps most difficult way to engender feelings of empathy and protection for a child character in an audience is to simply make the child a major character. This can be seen in games like the God of War Norse duology or the Last of Us series, which both featured main characters who are made responsible for a young child who accompanies them on a dangerous journey. Unlike Sean or Rose, God of War's Atreus and The Last of Us's Ellie are fully fleshed out characters who we come to learn about and care for as a natural part of the game's narrative, and their relationship with their player-controlled parental figures serves as a central part of their game's stories. In fact, the relationship between Atreus and his father Kratos, and between Ellie and her surrogate father Joel, pretty undeniably are the central narrative of their respective sagas, with all the god-slaying and zombie-killing serving merely as a background to stories about how parents raise their children, and how children change their parents. The Last of Us, in particular, is notable in how heavily its climax relies on aligning the motivations of both the player and Joel. After a whole game of bonding, adventure, and near-death experiences, the ending of the game involves Joel and Ellie finally reaching the hospital where the group called the Fireflies is working on a cure to the fungal zombie plague, to which Ellie, who is immune to the zombifying fungus, may be the key. It's only after you arrive, however, that you learn that the procedure to make a cure will involve extracting a sample of the fungus from her brain, almost certainly killing her. Instead of letting her go, Joel chooses instead to fight his way through, killing dozens of Firefly soldiers as well as possibly the only doctor capable of making a cure. And of course, the entire time he's guided by the player, who may or may not join him in recognizing the horror of his actions, but who definitely joins him in committing them, and should, ideally, agree that if it's to save Ellie, then it's all worth it. Storytelling is a difficult process, and one of the most difficult parts is generating within your audience feelings of empathy for your protagonists and their struggle. And it's easy to want to skip the necessary steps in hopes that your audience will simply connect with your characters through base contrivance and ostensible hooks. However, you cannot cheap out on developing those characters or establishing their relationships, even if you also want your audience to have a zippy good time shooting monsters or hitting Baldur in the face with a boulder. If you fail to establish your characters, then your narrative as a whole will crumble, and very simply, no one is going to want to play in your sandbox. Alright. Third essay in the bag. Hooray. Way to go. Took me a lot longer than I intended. A lot of stuff happened. Depression's a bitch. But, it's done. It's up. We keep on trucking, All you can really do. Push the boulder. Next essay is probably going to be on Resident Evil 4, on the remake. I think they do a lot of really cool stuff there. And then I'm going to have something on Cyberpunk Edgerunners coming up relatively soon. The anniversary for that is coming up, so hopefully people will be interested. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great day.